Today's first panel discussion is entitled, How Sports is the New Frontier of Data Use and Ownership. This panel is moderated by our good friend and past participant in our conferences, Tom Haberstroh, NBA analyst for the Bleacher Report. Tom is joined by co-moderator Angela Ruggiero, CEO and co-founder of Sports Innovation Lab, and panelists Ryan Capretta, founder and director, Proactive Sports Performance, Paul Robbins, performance consultant, Connexon for the NBA and the NHL and the USTA, and Sean Sansiveri, Vice President, Business and Legal Affairs for the National Football League Players Association, and Bob Lenaghan, Assistant General Counsel for Major League Baseball Players Association. Please welcome them.
This is the 14th or fourth time I've done this panel here at the USC Body Computing Conference. I want to thank Dr. Leslie Saxon for bringing me on as well. We have a really exciting panel today. We could not get LeBron James. We tried, but you're going to have to make do with this star-studded cast here. This is an important topic, not just for sports, but I think for the entire medical community and I think society in general. Wearables is huge. If you saw Jimmy Kimmel, Kelly Clarkson, and Charles Barkley eat a really hot pepper on TV and disseminate it on Twitter, hashtag ALS Pepper Challenge, that was because of my family. My mother was diagnosed with ALS this past year, and she has wearables that that tracks her movements to help her figure out where she's progressing or not progressing with her disease. And it's been hugely helpful for her not to just combat this disease, but actually know, okay, I feel like something's happening here, but now this is objective data to help me move along in this process. And in all of sports, we're facing that as well. I've been covering this topic for a long time, and since 2015, when we started having this panel, a lot has changed, and we'll get into that here. But gambling is a big one. Gambling, the federal legalization or lifting of the federal ban on gambling is going to be huge for sports, and it's going to bring this topic of health, injury data, privacy, all that stuff to the forefront. And I think it's going to be something that next year and the year after that, the discussion is just going to be even more rich. And so I've never done a co-moderator before, but I'm so pleased to announce Angela Ruggiero here. She is, unlike LeBron James, she actually is a Hall of Famer. She is the 2015 Hall of Fame class for hockey. She was also about a decade on the IOC, International Olympic Committee, serving on that board. She is the CEO and co-founder of the Sports Innovation Lab, and she is just about checks every box to be on this panel here, and I'm so glad to have her on the panel. And I said this on the phone when we talked the other day that I'm going to pass the ball to you, but she corrected me that it's pass the puck. So, Angela, take it away.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, really excited to be here. As Tom mentioned, I'm a four-time Olympian in ice hockey, spent 8 years representing athletes on the IOC, really what the issues of the athletes are. And now with my company, Sports Innovation Lab, we're looking at the entire sports technology industry. It is exploding. We have over 4,000 companies that we've aggregated and are looking at, and a large percentage of those are in this bucket called the quantified athlete bucket. Companies that are monitoring, measuring, predicting performance, preventing injury, everything we're talking about here today. So as Tom mentioned, that data is being used for performance, but also now because of entertainment, sport as an entertainment platform, leagues, teams, federations are really looking into how do we use that data for a fan engagement. So that's the conversation we want to have today. We have an excellent group of panelists today. Maybe what we can do is quickly introduce one another. You heard an overview of titles, but I think having context is more important than just titles. So maybe Ryan, you can start us out. You have a performance institute that you're training elite athletes, and I'm sure they're coming to you trying to understand what do I do with all this data? How do I integrate that into my training? Through the lens of sports technology, maybe you can just talk about your role quickly, how data influences it, and then we can move on to the broader conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So, I started my career on the team side. I worked in the NFL, worked at Stanford, and now I'm on the private side. So I've been able to see it from both sides. And I think the technology has been very helpful for these athletes. But I think also when you're looking at a pure off season and getting better, there's challenges, and that's where, working with Dr. Saxon and looking at what's out there and how can we apply it without taking away from the experience of the athlete. That's what we've really worked hard on over the past couple of years. So that's going to be exciting to see, is the application of the product and how the coach is using it, because it takes a full staff to really look at this data, and some people aren't equipped for that. So we've really spent a lot of time to make sure the athlete and the experience is at the forefront, because you lose the athlete. When you're dealing with these high-level guys, Aaron Rodgers and people like that, if you're not dialed in, it's gone. That equipment is dead to them, and they don't want to waste their time with it. So we have to be very careful on that front.
Paul, you're working with, you are a leading consultant in this space across the leagues and players, and have worked directly with the athletes themselves. What's your take in your role as you consult with the NBA and the NFL and other groups?
Well, it's changing quite a bit and expanding, obviously. But the NBA, this is my 9th season doing the performance data for the NBA, and so it's all the camera data that's collected in every single game. But for the most part, at this point, nobody other than the teams ever see my data. It's never gone out to the media. So where this gambling is going to fit in with this is going to be very interesting, because we're looking at speeds, power output, accelerations, decelerations of every athlete every quarter of a second in the game. And then that's what I consult back with the teams on. What does this mean? How do you design a program for recovery and stuff? So it's going to be very interesting. A lot of it now I'm doing with the USTA for tennis, because they have the Hawkeye data that everybody's been tracking the ball forever. Now we're actually tracking the players. But that's different because now it's at the individual player level. So it's a different dynamic there. The NHL, over there, I just oversee the combine, but we're bringing technology into the NHL combine. So we're actually tracking a lot more than just how many reps you did on the bench. We're tracking how fast were the reps, the velocity. So the technology is changing in each league a little bit different, but it's going to be interesting with the gambling where it ends up.
So Sean, you oversee a number of initiatives with the NFLPA, including the health and safety initiatives, and the conversation around the business of this is also part of your role. So how are you approaching this conversation in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's one small piece of a much larger conversation as it relates to athlete health and safety, medical research, overall wellness, performance, and that obviously ties into wages, hours, and working conditions, which is why the NFLPA and what the NFLPA exists ultimately to do. There's also this commercialization conversation. The NFLPA has a for-profit subsidiary called NFL Players Inc. That's one of the top licensors in the world, and the ultimate monetization of athlete data, we believe, will ultimately fit into that conversation, and we can talk more about that.
Awesome. Bob, last but not least, you got a big role with the MLBPA and really overseeing all the major CBAs and bargaining agreements. Data is, I'm sure, a big piece of that. How are you approaching that within your role?
Thanks, Angela. I'm basically a labor lawyer at heart. That's by training, what I've done. I'm probably the least techie person in this entire room. My role and my job is really to protect the athletes, the players we represent. And this is a very challenging new space for us. Players are interested in, tech that will help them improve their performance and injury prevention. They're not interested in it being used against them in contract negotiations. So that's the challenge we have to navigate, is, how we can take all the good out of tech while preventing the bad. It is a space, as everyone in this room knows, is exploding. We recently completed our collective bargaining agreement in 2016, and we actually included for the first time a provision on wearable tech and what can be used in-game or off the field. And again, from the Players Association standpoint, the key piece of that provision is it is completely and strictly voluntary by the player, and the player has a role in saying who sees the data. We're a ways away yet from the commercialization part of it. In fact, the CBA prohibits it from being used, any of that data being used commercially. That's not to say that down the road we're not going to get there. We understand, gambling is an area that's probably going to have a high demand for this information. We have concerns about, it is a good argument. A lot of this data is the players', health data and should be protected. So I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to learning a lot from everyone here. So thanks.
So last year in the NBA, there was over 5,000 games lost due to injury, which was a 12-year high since they started tracking games lost due to injury. It was up 25%. Guys were injured or spending time on the sidelines 25% more than they did in the previous year, which feels wrong because the NBA has been, I don't know if the forefront, maybe people disagree, but they have been in terms of player health and mental health. They've been at the forefront of trying to care for their athletes. They had a wearables committee in the CBA a few years ago and was established in 2016. And guys are getting injured a lot, and no one really knows why, what the reason is. But you see it in not just the NBA. It hasn't been tackled quite as well as we thought. In the NFL, Le'Veon Bell is sitting out. If anyone plays fantasy football, they know the name Le'Veon Bell, and I drafted him #1 overall, and he's not playing because of injury risk. He wants to make sure that his team is taking care of him on a contract, and he doesn't want to get injured that might jeopardize his long-term earning potential in the NFL. And in baseball, it seems like every other day I read that another star pitcher is going down with Tommy John. So or going for Tommy John surgery. So, I'll just kick things off here is when it comes to athlete data, what is the protocol in your respective sport? I'll start with you, Sean. The players own the data in terms of the performance data, the wearables data. Where do you think this space is going, not just now, but in the future?
Yeah, it's a big question that we're obviously thinking about regularly. You talk about injury risks. We have a 100% injury rate in the NFL. It's an inherently dangerous occupation. So when you think about use of data for health and safety purposes, there's obviously some tremendous value there. But we have to think about things like validation of technology as it moves from something that you simply wear on your wrist to monitor indirectly monitor heart rate or steps as it moves closer to a medical device, and therefore would have some of the protections that we're insisting upon through our collective bargaining agreement that would already come with federal law and other regulations. As it relates to sort of where this is going, ownership is a massive issue for us. We believe that the individual person, patient, athlete owns his data. And I don't think this is a dramatic or a novel concept. You think about the exhibition of a football game. The only reason that happens is because the members of the unionized workforce give the employer the right to display, to exhibit their image as a part of that game. This is no different. This is no different than publicity rights. This is no different than the exhibition of a game on Sunday. So that's where I think this is ultimately going to go under our new collective bargaining agreement and ongoing discussions. But there's always an employer trying to overreach on the other end. So
how does the non-guarantee or the guaranteed contracts fit into that picture? Are players less likely to be like, yeah, you can take all this data you want, but you're going to have to guarantee a little bit more money here?
I think it's always going to be a case-by-case situation with the younger guys. For instance, many of the millennials came up through the system wearing a lot of this technology. Some of the older guys, a 15-year vet is going to say, no way. And we see that whether it's as helmet technology improves, as other safety equipment continues to improve, even as treatment interventions and really well-meaning efforts to mitigate the long-term consequences of playing football sort of come into our industry. There are early adopters and late adopters, and I think the exact same thing is going to be true as it relates to use of data for performance, for health and safety, and ultimately on the monetization conversation as well.
So, Ryan, I have a question for you. The market's exploding. Everyone in this room, we're talking about healthcare. Sports is a microcosm of healthcare, right? The idea of quantifying an athlete for performance is really just a pressure test situation, a pressure test what could be possible in general healthcare. A lot of these companies that are getting into this market know if LeBron wears their wristband, suddenly the general market's going to want to prescribe to
Literally, that happened. The Whoop strap. LeBron James had a big part in popularizing
NFLPA,
it.
yeah. So that's the idea. You get a star athlete on a big platform performing their game, and now it's part of the mass market. So as these companies, whether that's genetic companies, blood, whether they're looking, so biometric data, whether that's looking at, hydration data. We talk about heart rate a lot in steps because it's easy for us to understand, but there's literally hundreds of these companies. How are you evaluating those? How are you thinking about what to talk to your athletes about using? And it must be it's an intense environment, exciting environment, but how are you making these decisions and really doing what's best for the athlete?
Yeah, so I think we first look at each athlete is different. They have different injury backgrounds. They have different things they're trying to accomplish during their off season, and some of these devices and newer types of equipment coming out, the technology, again, it comes back to user friendly, and it comes back to having people that can look at it and really understand what information it's going to give you, instead of just the wow factor. And that's where, again, we've been very fortunate to work very closely with Dr. Saxon and her team. We lean on them pretty heavily to say, hey, is this legitimate? Especially when you kind of dive more into a medical type device. So we're always on the player side, and is it going to help us evaluate that person and give us some tools to train them differently? We had a couple, one of our players, NBA All-Star player, was in, and he was having some challenges physically, coming off an injury, and it was a contract year and, all that stuff coming up. So we spent time, we went to different places in the country getting tested and looking at technology and looking at these things. Guys are different though, so like we were talking earlier, some of these younger guys, they're into that, and they want to be dissected in every single angle. So it really it comes down to the individual and the relationship, so you have to be very careful. I don't think it's a blanket answer, and that's where on our side, we're very kind of in-house, tight community to where the information that we do get, it has to stay with us. And that's even with, when you're dealing with the teams, the NFL, the NBA are very different. When we have our group of, 30-some NFL players training with us in the off season, very rarely do we hear from the teams. The NBA, every single basketball player we have, those ATCs, PTs, coaches, they're in there all the time.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's a couple things. I think one, you look at the size of the team, and I think the NBA has a little bit more of a stamp on each player as opposed to the NFL guys. And it's interesting hearing these guys. They love to bicker back and forth about guaranteed contracts and this and that, and so it's just a different culture. That's I don't know.
It also speaks to the continuity of care that is within each team's medical staff, and that's something we're constantly preaching. And if there's a disconnect between the strength and conditioning coach and the medical staff, when we talk about these injury rates and the exposure to injury based on the type of sport you're playing, if you have a breakdown in that system, no data is going to fix that. And I think that's
and we were just we work with a lot of the Rams, and they were talking about after their last game, they have these distinct juices that they drink, and it's a whole system. And then he went on to talk about, and this is like a 12-year vet, and how he's so appreciative that the staffs are all meshed together, and you don't see that at every team. From the PTs, the ATCs, the coaches, that's when it's special. When you have all these people that are connected and using their talents to put the best product for the player. And players see that very clearly. Not every team is like that. So it's fun to hear about the teams that really are meshed together with all their staffs.
Yeah, you talk about guaranteed contracts and what makes a guy want to play. When there's a team that has that continuity of care and that dedicated staff, it really makes a difference for where players ultimately want to end up.
Yeah.
And do you share the data with the teams that you're collecting?
That's good. It comes down to the player. If they're comfortable. For the most part, they're not wanting to do that. like one kid we've had forever, Christian Yelich, baseball player, we have data on him since he's 15 years old, and he's open with it. He doesn't mind. So I think it just kind of depends on the guy.
Bob, maybe you can address that directly. Who owns the athlete data? It's something, that's the name of this panel, and something that obviously the healthcare industry, all these companies creating products and services to support the athlete performance. Yeah, maybe they're going to move into entertainment. They're going to use that data for entertainment purposes, but we're focused on just performance. How do you approach that in your role?
I think it depends on the data you're talking about. In baseball, TrackMan and StatCast is the big thing where you have these radars and high-speed cameras in the field. I think MLB would argue that's their data. There's gray areas, and then there's data where we clearly, especially as an advocate for the union and the players, is clearly their data. If you want to do a DNA test on a player to try and create a workout program for him, there's no question it's his data. I think the way we've built our collective bargaining agreement and what we negotiated into is anything that a player is asked to put on his body to measure data is his, because he has the right to say no. And he also has the right to say who gets to see the data. Baseball players, Yelly is a good example, are all over the lot. Some players are very, free with that data and sharing it with the club and lots of people in the club, and others are not so trusting and aren't interested in sharing that data. But, therein lies the challenge is, we have I think there's a gray area where probably Office of Commissioner staff and club staff would say it's theirs, and players would say it's the player data. And I think at the end of the day, we need to work together, and we have a hard time doing that in baseball. If we really want to, especially when you talk about commercialization, if you go down that road. But in light of, you saw the last off season, data is being used by these sabermetrics staff people to say that once you're over a certain age, you're going to decline, or you're a starting pitcher and you can't get, they don't want you facing the lineup through the third time. So that's driving a lot of distrust by the players in the use of data, and it's going to be a real challenge for us going forward is to navigate that.
Yeah, what if there was a sleeve that they could put on the pitcher and say, hey, this will extend your career by 10%? Would the players be into that, or would they be like, hey, I see all these injuries and you're not letting me pitch for more than 5 innings, hey, back off?
Well, it's pitchers, I guess. But the guys that it really affects the most are pitchers, and the likelihood of Tommy John surgery. There's websites out there that created these algorithms that suggest that Jason DeGrom is going to break down in 2 years and need a Tommy John surgery. Hasn't been validated at all. There is a Modus sleeve that is actually approved for on-field use in baseball. I'm not sure that there's any pitchers that's actually using it in games at this point. I know there are pitchers that use it in the off season to help with their arm angle and things like that.
Why do you think they don't use it in games?
It's a good question. I think it runs a lot on the player. Either they don't trust it, they don't want the team to have it, that kind of data. They're not sure it's been validated enough to make career decisions off of it. They're like, I know my body, I know my elbow, I know my arm angle. A lot of it is distrust, I think, though, and not, a big challenge Sean alluded to is the validation of this stuff. You're going to be making career decisions here on your body, and the struggle is it hasn't really been independently validated, and a lot of this stuff doesn't appear to have been so.
So what if we're talking less about professional sports, because there's big dollars at play, obviously, for these professional athletes that their careers are on the line. I agree. You can't measure clutch. There's no wearable that's going to tell you you're going to be able to hit in the ninth inning. However, all these products are now moving into the youth sports market. You're right, Olympic athletes. We don't have the same unions that professional athletes have. So my coach tells me to wear something. Guess what? I got to wear it. I don't have a choice if I want to make that team. So it's not a financial discussion. How do you guys think in general about the market? Because we're here with a lot of healthcare professionals. You guys validate it to an extent, which I love about professional leagues. you're not going to put this on unless it's accurate. So is the industry becoming more accurate? Is it moving in that direction? Is trust really the biggest thing? Is it the league that you don't trust? Or is it the actual product you don't trust?
Yeah, and how do you go about where do you go?
That's the challenge. Okay, first, I mean, there are labs out there. The Air Force lab is validated and stuff. That's the challenge. We ask hard questions of the companies themselves that come in here and make presentations. We want you to get your players to use this widget, and we say, okay, show us the validation studies you've done that are independent, not in-house. And that's something a lot of players are very aware of and focused on and educated about. That you're asking me to make significant decisions and trust this, and I need to know that this is actually accurate information that's being gathered. So, and then there's just even if it is validated, athletes have a very limited career, right? Even a long career is a short career, and if it's going to hurt them in terms of their career path and their money-making potential, then they're not going to trust it. And unfortunately, there are a number of players who view it that way, that this is only going to be used against them. It's not going to be used to help them improve their performance or stay healthy.
Yeah, I think the old adage that if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you anything is particularly relevant here. And I always love, and I've heard this multiple times from some of our older players, that I haven't gotten slower, I've just become more efficient in space. And which
gotta use that.
I tell my employer that all the time. Ultimately, though, I do think that validation remains really primary in this space, and there's always going to be sort of this triangle of performers or relevant interested parties here, and it's going to be the manufacturer of the wearable, it's going to be the payer, if you will, whether it's the employer in the NFL or another professional sport or an NCAA school, and then it's going to be the individual who's wearing it. And I think every part of that triangle has a say in this and some role to play in terms of accountability. Ultimately, use case is really important here. Like, what is the purpose of the data collection? Are we just collecting data for the fun of it, or is it to gauge performance? Validation is really important in that space. Is it health and safety? Probably even all the more prominent and paramount there. Or is it fan engagement? Well, I mean, at that point, what's entertaining? What is a broadcast enhancement? Does the accuracy or predictive value ultimately matter as much? I mean, if it's sports betting, you would certainly argue yes in that case. So I think there's a lot of factors to consider.
Paul, what do you think? You're in the middle of this discussion. You work with all athletes, youth athletes, Olympic athletes, professional athletes. I mean, both you guys, they want accurate data so they can perform better. Is it moving in that direction?
We're very, very slowly. It's
Yeah.
moving because that's part of my job for most of the teams is to actually look at the technology. In the NBA this whole summer, teams would send me things to look at. We would try to get as much research on it and then try to validate it ourselves. And very few are passing the test. And there's actually 4 different levels. You guys have all spoke on them. I mean, there's the lower level, the Fitbits, the Whoops that we wear on the wrist, and that's kind of interesting. There could be some interesting data, but that the player can own that and have that. Then there's the next level, which what Ryan would have, it's going to be a higher quality. And then it's going to be something like, that's why I asked the question, you own it or the players own it, it's going to stay in-house, but it's more validated. Then you get to the next level, which is what the teams are using in practice. Now, there's some validation on that, but the problem that I keep running into is like, whatever Ryan's using might not be what the teams are using. So even if they're both validated, the data sets don't match.
Yeah, it's
so
two different languages.
Exactly,
Two
different language.
measurements.
Yeah, I'm looking. One's looking at, and then you go to the next level, which is the in-game, which you've got the Zebra, you got StatCast, and in our case we have this Second Spectrum now, the camera systems, where there's no technology on the player, it's just tracking the player. So now we have another set of technology, and none of those actually match up. So it's really hard to take, especially something all the way down from the wrist. Even if we say if it is valid, how does that match up to a camera system that you're seeing in game or an RFID system? So there's 2 questions there: validation, and then it's got to all be able to look in one platform and say, okay, that's exactly what's happening to the player throughout the game and practice and in preseason. And I think that's what my focus is on, is trying to understand right from the first level all the way up, and not just the reason I'm working with the USTA, we're definitely working at the high level. They have their new training center in Orlando. It's a huge brand new facility there, and their whole goal is obviously to get your top athletes for the US Open to go further. That's their whole goal. But really that technology, then we're trying to find, is there a Fitbit or Whoop that could work for somebody at your local health club? So what we're learning at the elite level, can we bring it down to someone just at the club level? So we're looking at that way, and that's a little bit different, but it's very interesting because it's at the individual level we can do a lot more.
Yeah, Sean, where is the monetization of performance data, advanced stats, next level analytics fit in with gambling? Because there is going to be this huge market push to have this part of the gambling conversation, is who's most likely to, I don't even know how to answer that, fill in the blank of how performance data becomes part of the gambling space, but as part of the licensing committee, where's this going? You know, like, am I going to watch on Monday Night Football? Hey, who's most likely to hit this top speed in the game, or who's most likely to have the hardest hit on the quarterback? That's all like, you know, wearable next level analytics space. How open are the players to handing over that data? How much money are we talking here?
Yeah, it's hard to predict, and to be honest, we are very deep in a lot of these conversations, and it's not evolving as quickly as you might expect. When you're thinking about the whole space of sports betting is evolving very quickly, but the use of player biometric data within that space seems to be inching along, and I think it's because there's a lot of uncertainty. How exactly you would make a prop bet based on somebody's heart rate while they're kicking a field goal, for instance, has a lot of hurdles prior to one being able to say that the way you're monitoring and collecting that data is actually accurate, how you actually get that off the wearable to a sports book or whoever's setting the bet there, and whether the individual athlete's even willing to do that and what it's ultimately going to take. So there are conversations being had, obviously, but I think we're a ways away from it still. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
I do think that the monetization play has a ton of different growth angles, whether it's benchmarking against individual athletes, whether it's fan engagement, whether it's VR, AR, mixed reality. There's a number of digital trading cards, video games. There's a lot of areas that we're actively exploring where athlete biometric data could be potentially valuable, separate from the betting space.
What specific biometrics are most interesting for?
We're hearing different interest from different parties. It depends on the product. I mean, a digital trading card can make use of everything from heart rate to muscle activation to XY data and speed. A video game may be more focused on a player's avatar and therefore want a 3D motion capture. Right, so we're kind of out there in the marketplace talking to a lot of potential vendors as a licensor, which is what we are. We don't build products. We're talking to a lot of vendors to say, what kind of data would you actually want, and maybe help us build this infrastructure.
So I'm hearing two things today. One, it's about performance. Really, it's about these different wearables, these different data sources can now personalize your training. You can actually prescribe, working with it, obviously individuals, it's not the tech in and of itself, but it'll help you really achieve success at the highest level. And as an Olympic athlete, I was looking for little inches. So if data and technology is going to allow me to get an edge on my competitors, I'm all over that. And then two, it's about, okay, aside from performance, it's about entertainment. Assuming this data is accurate, which is a big part of this conversation, how can it be monetized? And if it's going to be monetized, is that going to be shared with the players themselves? Like, is that the general conversation you guys are hearing in the market? Is there anything that this group in particular would be interested in from a medical perspective as they think about bringing technologies into the sports landscape?
I think what I hear all the time from player unions is, as soon as the players can make some money off of it, then it's going to move forward quickly. Mm-hmm. I don't know. These two would be the experts on how that's going to move forward quickly, but that's what I keep hearing from the players. and the teams themselves. It's like the players have to be involved. And I have actually met with a company that's actually working on the back end of that right now. They're planning for it. At some point, heart rate is going to be collected from an athlete, but then how does it get out to whoever? And I know there's companies working on that right now.
Yeah, I think the medical space is slightly different than what we're talking about on the licensing side, and you think validation in the sports arena is difficult. Validation in the medical arena, as we all know, is drastically different. We just spun out a technology called bioenhanced ACL repair that the NFL Players Association has invested in, and we're looking at commercializing a number of other treatment interventions, things like antibody therapy for tau and CTE, and soft bracing technology and cold fluid therapy for sleep apnea. And you want to really nerd out, that's where a lot of this conversation is going. But from a practical standpoint, when you think about the commercialization of data, you got to think about scalability. So in the NBA, you have approximately 400 players. In the NFL, you have 1,600 players. To go out as a vendor and do an individual deal with every single last one of those players would be tremendously difficult, the same way it is for jerseys, same way it is for video games, trading cards. And that's why you've seen the emergence of a group licensing program across all the major sports over the last 50 years. And I think the same applies to data. If you want to have a one-stop shop to collect a bunch of validated data from on-field usage or off-field training data, then ultimately you're going to have to work with the union. The union's going to make sure that the protections, the security, the privacy, cybersecurity, et cetera, are all in place.
Yeah, I think for this, you're asking about the medical group. I think it's already going on in large part. For example, with StatCast, they measure the spin rate of a pitcher's curveball, say breaking pitch. And I know of a case with one club last year that the player had come off an injury, was coming off the DL, was rehabbing, and they were very focused on when that spin rate returns to his pre-injury level. And my understanding is they didn't activate him until it hit that point. So there's a lot of data collection going on right now, just tons of data being collected and looked at, and I know they're doing comparisons now, and just to see what led to this breakdown. Can we go back and look at their loads, the extent they've gathered that data, look at their spin rate, look at their, all that. And that in the medical space is something I think there are doctors. We have meetings, in the winter meetings in Las Vegas this year, they have medical meetings, and doctors are very, last year, there was a vendor there who got some tough questioning about the validation of what he's using. But I think that's where the medical field really comes into play, by asking the hard questions of these vendors out there. And then if the doctors are satisfied it's been validated, they can then use this to try and go back and look and recreate the wheel and say, why did this pitcher blow out his elbow? Is there a way we could have prevented it by looking at this data that's now can be gathered, that's been validated, and so that in the future it'll prevent the next pitcher from blowing out.
And that just takes a lot of time as well, because we looked at that in basketball. Well, actually, I looked at it in soccer when I was doing European soccer years ago, and they wanted 5 or 6 years worth of data from, at that point, it was the Pro Zone system out there, before the universities would start looking at it. This is our 5th full season in the NBA. So before the first few seasons that I did it, we didn't have the entire league. We just did certain teams. So we just feel now that we actually have some good data to go back and look at those loads, to give you an opinion on somebody and what's a high load and what's not. And with, again, 450 players, which is not a lot, and actually not even that many because a lot of them don't even play. They're at the end of the bench. So we just didn't have enough data. That's the most important thing.
I think what's going on in baseball, because you have the minor leagues as well, they're not represented. They're kind of like you were. And there are a lot of teams we understand who are mandating that these players give them that data. So I believe on that side of the ledger, there's a lot of like the kind of work that Paul's talking about, doing a lot of study and kind of looking at all the data they've collected from the minor league side who aren't represented by the union and are required to wear these devices and measuring that in that way.
And the longitudinal data really does start to become interesting, and I think everybody acknowledges that. We have an injury surveillance system that's been in place in the NFL for years and years, and once EMRs came into existence, that data became much more reliable, and we've been able to use it for safety equipment, for instance. We've done about 4 years of helmet testing in the lab looking at high-performing helmets in terms of head impact and potential injury severity, and we've now been able to match that against injury data, and as a result showed that our lab testing correlated with on-field data, and those who actually were suffering concussions or many of those who were suffering concussions were in the lower performing helmets, and as a result the NFLPA and the NFL announced this year that 10 helmets were actually prohibited from use in the NFL. And so the longitudinal data does have value, but it really does have to be validated, collected over time, and really considered.
I just got word that we will have a Q&A session. It will be after this next presentation, so I ask you guys to sit tight, and then we will wrap up then. So thank you, and if you have any questions, again, we will be answering them, and thanks to everyone on the panel for all the insights.